What if the world's next country already has its own government army elections, and people, yet officially does not exist? Across the globe, millions of people believe their homeland deserves a place on the map. But history, politics, and international law keep standing in the way. Some have already voted almost unanimously for independence, while others have quietly governed themselves for decades without global recognition. Behind every border lies a story of colonial legacies, forgotten wars, valuable resources, and geopolitical rivalries that still shape our world today. Before this century reaches its midpoint, several new nations could emerge, and the race to become the world's next sovereign state has already begun. Most new countries are born through war, revolution, or the collapse of empires, making peaceful paths to independence remarkably rare in the modern world. Yet across several distant corners of the globe, millions of people believe they are already nations, waiting for the rest of the world to acknowledge them. Their stories begin with different cultures, different histories, and different continents. But they all revolve around the same powerful question of self-determination. International law recognizes both territorial integrity and the right of peoples to govern themselves, creating a difficult balance that rarely satisfies everyone. That conflict between legal recognition and popular will has shaped some of the most fascinating political disputes of the 21st century. Among all the places seeking statehood, Bougainville stands closer than almost any other territory to becoming the world's newest independent nation. This small Pacific archipelago may appear insignificant on a map, yet its modern history has been marked by extraordinary sacrifice and determination. During the late 20th century, the enormous Panguna copper mine generated vast wealth for foreign interests, while leaving local communities with environmental destruction and deep resentment. Growing frustration eventually erupted into a brutal civil war that lasted nearly a decade and claimed thousands of lives across the islands. When peace finally arrived, negotiators agreed that the people themselves would one day decide Bougainville's political future through a democratic referendum. That historic vote produced one of the most overwhelming results ever recorded in a modern independence referendum. Nearly every voter supported breaking away from Papua New Guinea, demonstrating a level of national unity rarely witnessed anywhere else. Even so, an overwhelming vote alone could not instantly transform Bougainville into a sovereign country recognized around the world. The referendum required further negotiations because the final decision still depended on approval from Papua New Guinea's national institutions. Economic sustainability quickly became the central issue, with critics questioning whether the islands could finance an independent government without outside assistance. Bougainville's leaders rejected that argument, insisting similar doubts have historically been used to postpone independence movements across many former colonies. While Bougainville waits for its political future to be finalised, another territory has already spent decades functioning almost exactly like an independent country. Somaliland has built democratic institutions, maintained public order, collected taxes, and organised peaceful transfers of power, despite receiving almost no international recognition. Its experience challenges one of the most basic assumptions in global politics, by proving that effective statehood and legal recognition are not always the same thing. These remarkable cases reveal that the journey toward nationhood rarely begins with drawing new borders, but with people refusing to abandon the belief that they already belong to one. New Caledonia offers one of the clearest examples of how history continues to shape political conflicts more than a century after colonial rule first began. New Caledonia offers one of the clearest examples of how history continues to shape political conflicts more than a century after colonial rule first began. France claimed the islands during the 19th century, gradually transforming indigenous Kanak communities into minorities within parts of their own ancestral homeland. Decades of political tension eventually produced a peace agreement that promised the people a democratic path toward deciding their constitutional future. The agreement called for a series of carefully planned independence referendums, each designed to measure whether public opinion had shifted over time. The first two votes showed support for independence steadily increasing, giving many observers reason to believe the final referendum might become historically decisive. Everything changed when the pandemic struck, disrupting daily life and devastating many Kanak communities just before the last scheduled vote. Independence leaders appealed for a delay, arguing that widespread mourning and public health concerns made a fair campaign virtually impossible. French authorities refused to postpone the referendum, prompting many pro-independence voters to boycott the process altogether. The official result overwhelmingly rejected independence. Yet critics argued that a vote without meaningful participation from the principal indigenous community lacked democratic legitimacy. Political tensions intensified even further when proposed electoral reforms threatened to expand voting rights to newer residents from mainland France. Many Kanak leaders believed those changes would permanently reduce indigenous political influence, making future independence almost impossible, regardless of public sentiment. The demonstrations that followed escalated into deadly riots, exposing how unresolved constitutional questions can quickly evolve into violent national crises. Thousands of kilometers away, another people have pursued the dream of statehood for more than a century without ever seeing it fully realized. The Kurdish people share a distinct language, cultural identity, and historical homeland, yet remain divided across several modern states created after the First World War. Although earlier international agreements briefly envisioned a Kurdish homeland, shifting geopolitical realities erased that promise before it could ever become reality. Iraqi Kurdistan has developed extensive self-government, including its own parliament, security forces, and many of the practical institutions associated with statehood. Even after an overwhelming referendum supporting independence, regional governments and much of the international community refused to endorse Kurdish sovereignty. Geography, competing political movements, and the determined opposition of neighbouring states continue to limit Kurdish aspirations despite generations of persistent activism. Together, New Caledonia and Kurdistan demonstrate that popular support alone rarely creates a country, when history, regional politics, and international interests point in different directions. While some independence movements struggle against historical grievances, others are being reshaped by the rapidly changing realities of the modern geopolitical landscape. Greenland has quietly become one of the most strategically valuable territories on Earth, despite having a population smaller than many medium-sized towns. Although it remains an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, the island already manages many of its own domestic affairs through its elected parliament. For decades, independence was viewed as a distant aspiration because Greenland relied heavily on financial support from Copenhagen to sustain essential public services. That calculation has begun to change as scientists uncover the extraordinary economic potential hidden beneath Greenland's vast ice sheet. The island possesses enormous reserves of rare earth elements: nickel, copper, lithium, and other critical minerals needed for advanced technologies and the global energy transition. At the same time, rising Arctic temperatures are gradually opening new shipping routes that could transform Greenland into a major crossroads between North America, Europe, and Asia. Those developments have attracted growing attention from major powers, turning Greenland from a remote territory into an increasingly important strategic prize. Its leaders insist that Greenland's future belongs to its own people, even as outside powers recognise the island's expanding geopolitical significance. Scotland presents a very different path toward possible independence, because its debate unfolds entirely within one of the world's oldest constitutional democracies. The independence referendum held during the previous decade appeared to settle the issue after voters chose to remain within the United Kingdom. Everything shifted when Brexit removed Scotland from the European Union, despite a clear majority of Scottish voters supporting continued membership. Many people who had previously opposed independence began reconsidering whether their political future could truly be secured within the existing constitutional arrangement. Public opinion gradually moved toward an almost even divide, making Scotland one of the closest democratic independence debates anywhere in the world. The greatest obstacle is no longer public support, but the legal requirement that any future referendum must receive approval from the government in Westminster. Until that constitutional deadlock changes, Scotland's political future remains suspended between democratic ambition and legal limitation. Comparing all 6 cases reveals that no single formula determines whether a new nation will eventually emerge onto the world stage. Popular support, historical identity, economic viability, international recognition, and great power interests must align before sovereignty becomes more than an aspiration. Some territories appear remarkably close to crossing that threshold, while others continue waiting despite generations of extraordinary persistence and sacrifice. By the middle of this century, the world's map may look different. but the birth of every new nation will ultimately depend as much on global politics as on the will of its own people. So what truly creates a country? A border on a map? A vote at the ballot box? Or the determination of people who refuse to surrender their identity? The evidence suggests that independence is never decided by public support alone, but by the difficult intersection of history, economics, international law, and global power politics. Among all the movements we explored, some appear closer than ever to achieving sovereignty, while others continue navigating obstacles that have endured for generations. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that borders once considered permanent can change when political realities evolve, and the international community eventually accepts a new status quo. The next nation to appear on the world map may already exist in everything but name. And when that moment finally arrives, it could redefine far more than a single border.